Yes.
Good evening. This is a meeting of the Finance Committee of the Board of Trustees of the Village of Wilmette. Staff will now please call the roll.
Trustee Plunkett.
Here.
Trustee Sullivan.
Here.
And Chair Kennedy.
Here. We have a quorum, obviously. Now I'm going to read this statement because I should have it memorized by now. I've heard it so many times, but I don't. So this meeting is being conducted remotely by Microsoft Teams. For those watching this video in the future, the Open Meetings Act was amended and public bodies may now conduct remote public meetings by audio or video conference without a quorum physically present when the governor or director of the Illinois Department of Public Health has issued a disaster declaration related to public health concerns. Our meeting tonight is being broadcast live on our local cable access channel 6. It is also being broadcast on the internet on YouTube Live, and the URL for that is www.youtube.com/user/Village-of-Wilmette/live. If you would like to participate in the meeting, you may use the Microsoft Teams app on any device. The link to join each meeting is posted on the website calendar at www.wilmette.com/calendar. The meeting will be archived on the Village's website as we do with all our other televised public meetings. A remote meeting requires a different mechanic for public participation so as to ensure that all of our residents, business owners, and other interested parties have the opportunity to participate in this meeting. We have solicited public comment prior to the start of the meeting by email, and if you sent an email to publiccomment@wilmette.com prior to the start of the meeting, our staff will read that email during the public comment portion of our agenda. If members of the public who are watching the broadcast would like to participate during our designated public comment periods, you may submit your comments through YouTube Live at the appropriate time, and a member of the Village staff will read your comment to the Finance Committee. All comments to the Finance Committee will be recorded in the meeting minutes, as we typically do. Everyone will have joined the meeting tonight muted. When it is time for public comments, those joining us with the Teams app, I think, can toggle their mute status by clicking on the microphone icon on the meeting toolbar. Those joining us by audio conference dial-in can toggle their mute status by pressing *6. Only attendees can unmute themselves. No one can unmute another attendee. And just a reminder that public comment can also be provided by emailing publiccomment@wilmette.com or through the Village's YouTube live stream. Before the meeting, the Finance Committee received a packet of agenda materials. These materials are also posted on wilmette.com so that residents and other interested parties can review the very same materials that the Finance Committee members received. Now, I will move on to the agenda. So I believe the first thing on the agenda is the public comment. Are there any public comments tonight?
So Lynn, I know, is checking. Do you want to unmute, Lynn? Thanks.
Yes, there are no public comments on YouTube Live.
Are there any comments?
And additionally, there were no comments submitted through the public comment email address.
Thank you. I believe the second item on the agenda is approval of the minutes of the prior Finance Committee meeting. Is there a motion to accept the minutes?
So moved. I'll second Cinta's motion.
Okay, the motion comes from Trustee Plunkett and seconded by Trustee Sullivan. So it has passed. At this point, I will turn the meeting over to Melinda Malloy and Eric Hallgren of the staff, who will give us a presentation.
So we've prepared a presentation for this evening's discussion on the Village's reserve policy, and I will start that in one moment. All right, can everybody see the presentation?
Yes.
Yes.
All right. So at our last Finance Committee meeting that was held on January 27th, we provided a background information related to the village's reserve policy. We looked at what our current reserve policy was. We also looked at best practices. This included looking at comparable communities as well as looking at guidance from GFOA. And then one of the last components that we looked at from a background perspective was looking at the impact on the bond rating. So the village currently maintains a AAA bond rating, and our financial advisors provided us an analysis of what a potential downgrade from a AAA rating would mean from a financial perspective on future bond issuances. So after our significant conversation and going through this background information, the Finance Committee directed staff to develop a draft reserve policy. So based upon the feedback from the committee members, what we sought to do as part of this draft reserve policy was to provide clarity on how the reserves were calculated. We also sought to streamline the document so that it was more comprehensible for everybody who was reading it. We also set a target reserve to maintain our AAA bond rating. This was in our past reserve policy, but we memorialized it again in this one as well. We also wanted to make sure that we included in this draft reserve policy how we would define a plan if we had reserves in excess of our target, so essentially a drawdown plan. And then the second component to that was if at any point in time we were to fall below our reserve minimums, how we would develop a plan to rebuild those reserves. And then the last part that we had comments on was around our stormwater utility, which was implemented in 2020. The stormwater utility is a reasonably stable revenue source, and what we did as part of this was sought to break it out from the overall sewer fund to have its own calculation associated with it, separate from the general operations of the sewer fund. So all of those different components were built into the reserve policy that was included as part of the agenda. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Ms. Malloy to walk through the different components of the reserve policy.
So thank you, Mr. Holgren. So as you saw in the material packet that you have, the draft reserve policy is really broken into 6 sections. And really the way I sort of wrap my head around this is talking about the why, how, what, when, and where is sort of happening. So the purpose is really why. Why do you have a reserve policy? What's the rationale? The reserve level calculation, that's the how. How are we getting to the number that we're proposing? The reserve levels are telling you what we are looking to have in terms of what those reserve levels would be. The when is telling you how would we use the reserves that we have. And then those last 2 items, the reserves in excess of the target and the reserve replenishment, are kind of where questions. Where are you going to allocate monies to and where are you going to get monies from? So as Eric goes to the next slide, we're going to start with the first section, which is the purpose. So that's really answering that why question. The first bullet point, this one would make sense to you because it is trying to cover the idea of having a rainy day fund. So you would want a reserve for that purpose. You would also want one to make sure that you have sufficient cash flows for operation needs. The reason why you need that is dollars are not going out the door necessarily when you're getting dollars in the door. The example that we've used previously with you is property taxes. Remember, that's our largest revenue source in the general fund. It comes in basically twice a year. And yet we have our payroll expenses, benefits, and the what have you happening every single month. So really, in most months, our expenditures are exceeding the revenues that are coming in the door. So we need a reserve for cash flow purposes. As Eric has already laid out before, we want to maintain the village's bond rating. We also want to provide funds for unseen expenditures. An example of this would be the economic relief grants that we just were able to provide in 2020. And then those last two bullet points we've talked about a lot before in the past, which is our infrastructure investment program. So think the road program, and then our capital equipment replacement program, which is really the SERV. So we are utilizing reserves in that situation so that we can make thoughtful decisions about how to address our infrastructure and our capital equipment needs. And we are able to accomplish quite a bit without having to do bond issuances.
So moving over to the next part of Melinda's layout of looking at the how, and really when we're looking at the reserve calculation, we've had discussions in the past of whether or not we're going to utilize revenues or expenditures for the calculation associated with the reserves. This policy changes that methodology from historically utilizing revenues, moving them over to the expenditure side. The reason that we included this in this draft policy is because we find that expenditures are more stable and predictable comparatively to revenues. We know when our dollars are going to go out the door, and there's less concern about instability in the market associated with like home rule sales tax or other revenue sources coming in. The second component of that was really when we look at expenditures, those are the financial requirements that we need to fund the public services, from our police services to fire services to finance, community development, to public works. And we want to ensure that those funds are available for those purposes. So by building a reserve based off of the expenditures, it helps us to make sure that we have a certain coverage for the expenses that we planned out during the year to provide services to our community. And then the last part of this calculation was when we were looking at expenditures, it really making sure that we wanted to include items that happen on an annual basis. We excluded capital expenditures such as central or looking at the neighborhood storage project, because those expenses are funded by borrowing, and we don't want to include those as part of our reserve requirements on an annual basis. We really want to know what the village needs on an annual basis for each one of our major operating funds, and then make sure that we have reserves in place to cover those expenditures. Then looking at the reserve levels. So this is really looking at how much our recommendations are for each one of the funds. We focused on the three major operating funds of the village. We excluded all other reserve requirements for other funds. In our current policy, there was a threshold for our motor fuel tax. That was really because of cash flow and the state not dispersing funds. But where we wanted to focus was on these major funds: the general fund, the water fund, and the sewer fund. And when I talked earlier about streamlining the document, part of it was just making it very straightforward as to the calculation that we wanted to utilize for each one of these funds. So as part of the draft policy, what we've included is a minimum reserve of 25% and a target reserve of 30% for the general fund. For the water fund, a minimum reserve of 20% and a target of 25%, which is equivalent to where it currently sits at now. And then the sewer fund, we broke it into two parts. So excluding all of the stormwater utility expenditures, the debt service, the stormwater incentive program, the cost of operating that utility, personnel costs, other components. Once we back those out of the sewer fund, we followed a very similar reserve of 20% minimum and a target of 25% for the sewer fund. Along with that, we also included a target reserve level of 5% for the stormwater utility expenditures. The reason that we kept this at a low level, but we kept dollars there, was to make sure that we had appropriate cash flow coming for the stormwater utility. We also, in our calculations, have expected a 5% collection factor as part of our modeling. So we wanted to make sure that we could cover that 5% non-collection factor. But we know that the expenditures or the revenues and the expenditures associated with the stormwater utility are extremely stable. They're known entities, especially after we issue debt, and we know what our quarterly billings are going out and when we can expect those dollars coming in. So those were really across those three funds, those are the reserve levels that we included as part of this policy.
So Eric, can I ask a question going back on this? And maybe it's just because, and I think this is very good and long overdue, and it'll help, but where I think, to me, it's all in the wording. And I worry about, because in the presentation, what I read, it says, you know, we're very specific on a target of 30%. And it's the issue I have with it is, would we be better off just saying a minimum reserve of X, and not necessarily a target? Because I think that's some of the consternation we see is that we haven't been close to target. I think and I'm looking at the general reserve. I mean, today, what are we reserved at? If I did the calculation, we're about 38%.
I think based upon.
So are we boxing ourselves too much in by the wording of this versus like a minimum of 30 and leave it at that?
Part of our rationale when we were going through this was we felt that this was kind of giving us a little bit more flexibility by giving us the different parameters. We wanted to make sure that we always would have using the general fund as an example, that we would have that minimum reserve of 25% before we had to put into place some sort of replenishment plan. But if the reserves were to sit between 20 and 25%, there wouldn't be any action required on the village's behalf. When we look to set that target at that higher threshold of 30%, that is really paying homage to the maintenance of the AAA bond rating. And so what we've heard from the credit or from the ratings agencies is that 30% is really a good target for us to have. And us having that 30% mark out there has helped us to manage our finances more appropriately, at least based upon the past conversations that we've had. And so we felt that by giving a minimum amount and then a target amount gave us broader flexibility, as opposed to setting a minimum reserve level of 30%. Because if we were to fall below that, all of a sudden we have to build a plan or put in place a plan to replenish it back up to that 30%. But if we're falling between 25 and 30, we've kind of hit that sweet spot from a reserve level perspective.
Okay, got it.
If
I
you
have a
don't
few
mind,
questions, Eric, but maybe we should, do you want to just finish first and then take questions, or?
I think we can take questions as we go along. But if we're going to have more questions on the values of where we're currently sitting at, that's one of the last slides that we have. So yeah. it is in the presentation.
Okay, you know what, I'm going to hold my questions till the end because I don't want to be redundant or stop you midstream. Thanks.
Okay. All right. So I'm going to turn it back over to Melinda for the uses of reserves.
So as you look at the bullet points on this slide, and as I was saying too before, this is really what I consider answering the when question. It mirrors pretty much the purpose of why we're even having reserves to begin with. So the first bullet point, and it's bolded there, we're trying to stress that one of the reasons that we would have reserves would not be to solve any structural deficit issues. So think of it as we're not building reserves to so that we can meet payroll. We're not building reserves so that we can keep the lights on at our facilities. So it really is for all these other purposes that we have enumerated here. So it's for emergency situations that can occur, for unexpected revenue reduction tied to actions of other governmental agencies. An example could be that we've seen before in the past that the state, for its own reasons, has delayed or changed the way that payments are allocated to municipalities. So that has happened to us before in the past. We would need it for the outlay of capital due to major failure or breakdown. So think about it when we have water main breaks or things such as that occurring. This next bullet point, in terms of the intentional drawdown of excess reserves, that's we were kind of talking about that in the last slide. And by that, I mean, we are either going to do it because of allocations to the SURF or to infrastructure projects. So that would be an intentional use of it. We have a slide later on that we're going to be talking about some other ideas of where we would take those reserves and allocate them to. The pension funds is another one, but it's the excess reserves that we have, or any other expenditures that are deemed necessary. Again, I'm going to use the example that we had before, where we had the business grants that we were able to allocate in 2020 as the pandemic was happening. So as Eric goes to our next slide.
Can we stop for just a second?
Yes.
As I was reading that last one, other expenditures deemed necessary, that seems to be an exception that just encompasses the world. Almost anything can be deemed necessary, at which point you can use the reserve fund under this policy for anything you deem necessary. I don't think that's quite what you intended. Is there some way to sort of narrow this down so that it's more reflective of an unusual expenditure that's responsive to the conditions at the time?
We absolutely can, and it probably should be one that we could add to this, that it would be that the board deemed necessary, or that somehow we bring it back. It really was, you are correct. It's an all-encompassing statement because we cannot always think about what might be happening in the future, but we could definitely put some more parameters around it that would say that there needs to be some sort of action taken by the board, or that the board is notified. Would that be something, or do you really want it even narrowed more than that?
I don't think it's a question for me so much about the process, because I assume that the board can always approve or not approve what happens. Yep. So that it's a question of what necessity means, I guess, is what I would say. So necessary is in the eye of the beholder, and any other expenditure deemed necessary can be just about anything. And I think what we're really talking about is unusual occurrences that create an expense, not ordinary expenditures. But I would think that this language as it now is encompasses even ordinary expenditures if you decide that they're necessary. In other words, you could draw it down because there's a structural deficit and you want to use the reserves to plug a hole in a structural deficit. And I don't think that's what we want. I don't think that's where we're aiming. I don't think that's what you intended, but.
Correct. I agree with that last statement, which is why we started this saying that we definitely don't want to. But to your point, right, you are correct. It is broad enough that just about anything then could fit into that category.
Right.
So with the idea of, or any other extraordinary, unusual expenditures.
Something like that, yes.
Okay, we can definitely work on conveying that thought that again, let us take another shot at that. I think I understand what you're trying to say.
Well, let me ask my fellow
what you're trying to make.
Is that something that you would be in agreement with Trustee Plunkett and Trustee Sullivan?
So I'm looking at this list and I'm wondering where our business grants would have fallen if not into other expenditures deemed necessary. Like, I mean, there was an emergency in the pandemic, but this wasn't critical services.
Correct.
So I do think it's broad, but something like the business grants that we did take out of reserves,
yeah,
wouldn't have another place to go.
But could we fix that by sort of bumping up number 2, unexpected revenue reduction or necessary expenditures due to an emergency? So that at least we're tying what is necessary to a condition or an action instead of just leaving it open.
I think if we're able to find the correct modifier on that last bullet point of adding something along the lines of extraordinary or unusual to go in front of expenditures, I think we can rework the wording. That I think that something along the lines of business grants would be able to fall into that space. I think along Melinda's description of just saying that other expenditures deemed necessary, I think by adding those modifiers, we can make that fit into that definition, and other things that would go before the village board ultimately for their decision before any funds are expensed. It would be at the discretion of the village board to deem it as an unusual or an extraordinary expenditure. So I
Okay.
think we can play with the wording in that would capture that.
Okay, thanks. I like that.
And then just one more, I guess, corollary to this. You know, this is before I was on the board. I think we all were. You know, when we were in the recession and our reserve level dropped to, wasn't it like $2 million?
Yes.
What was going on at that point with, you know, the reserves, and were there board actions to draw down the reserves to pay for things, or what happens in that kind of, you know, it's not a one-time emergency, but it's, you know, a longer term recession?
So if I understand the question that you're asking, so really in that situation, we were at a place that we did not have what I would consider excess reserves. How our policy was designed at that point in time was really sort of centered around the idea of, did we have enough reserves for cash flow purposes so that we didn't have to go out and do short-term borrowings to float ourselves for a while. So that really was, if you remember our discussion that we had last time, that is really what informed and shaped our existing general fund reserve policy that we had in place. So we did not have any excess reserves to do anything with, which is why we didn't have a SURF in place either. So is that addressing your question?
I guess so. So it wasn't that we were pulling from the reserves, it's that nothing was being saved, and over time the reserve level got shrunk. Is that correct?
That could be a way to phrase it. Yes, you are correct.
Yeah.
There was no way to build our reserves because there was no revenues that were coming in at that point in time that would allow us to do it. Our reserves truly were just enough to help prevent us from having to go and issue like a tax anticipation warrant or money for working cash purposes. It helped us avoid doing that we were just at that place.
Okay, thank you.
So in this next item, so really with the question that Trustee Plunkett just had, this next slide then is talking about when you have reserves in excess of the target, what are some of the ideas or the ways that those monies will be used? So we first started with the idea of, if the target levels are more than 5%, we will notify staff, or village board, staff will notify the village board. So that occurs, I think, in the monthly reporting that we do and in other discussions that we have. We also have the bullet point here about the plan will include a 3-year outlook, because we know that what you see happen in a vacuum in 1 year, you really do need to look over the next several years to help understand, is it a plan buildup that's actually going to spend down over time? Here's an example that I'll give you. When we've talked about how we are ending 2020, we know some of the reserve that was created was from the deferral of capital projects that we are planning to do in 2021. That's where the perspective in terms of looking over time, it helps you understand what will happen with those reserves. But as I have talked about before, here's some other ideas about potential uses. Allocating money to the SURF, we have done that. We have said before in the past that 50% of non-recurring revenue that comes in would be allocated to the SURF. We have allocated additional funds to our infrastructure investment program. Again, additional monies going into the roads. We have allocated money to the public safety pension funds. This is to allow us to get to the 15-year rolling amortization. We could allocate money to other major capital projects. In this case, we had talked last time about Central Avenue, that there's been some discussion, because we plan to issue a bond for that the board could decide that instead of going to the market to cover the cost of that capital project, we could use some of our excess reserves and avoid the borrowing. And you can review other potential revenue offsets. in this regard, I'm thinking about as you are looking at your reserves over time, you could look at some of your fee structures to see if I lower the fee, I could start drawing down on reserves. You could either hold your fee flat, that would allow that to happen, or you could actually make adjustments down. So that was sort of the idea behind these bullet points.
I have a question about the one thing in connection with the concern about the pandemic. We did some cutback on capital expenditures, for example, in the sidewalk sort of restoration program. That's just an ongoing program where you go through a quarter of the village at a time and you fix the sidewalks. Some of that got deferred or that got cut back a little bit. And could we catch up on everything that was deferred in the first year after the pandemic within these guidelines if we wanted to, instead of just pushing everything off and off and off and off 1 year?
Yes, so as an example, the sidewalk program or another program along those lines would fall into the infrastructure investment program, that one specifically. If there were other areas that were in kind of that grouping of projects, we could certainly allocate additional dollars to that. This was just a listing of potential options. It wasn't meant to limit anything, but if there are any other specific areas that any of the board members would like to add to this, I think that this would be an opportunity for us to add other potential uses, but we were trying to go with broader categories versus really honing in on specific items.
Sure.
Oh, shoot. Can we, oh, I see myself. Sorry, my camera was off. The infrastructure investment program, I mean, the SURF is, very well defined. And I'm not sure if our infrastructure investment program is as defined, or maybe in terms of, how we are using that and what it's for and all of that. Is that something that we can go into maybe either now or at the end of the presentation?
So I think as you can tell, Eric is pulling up the cash flow on it. And you might recall that we used to call this the engineering dedicated program. And that seemed to cause confusion about what did that really mean. So it was renamed last year, the infrastructure investment, and it encapsulates things such as the road work that we do, the sidewalk, and I'm sorry, Eric, if you want to pull up the rest of it, it will show you the revenues that are actually dedicated to this program, and it will show you then the expenditures that we have as well. But I think as Eric is scrolling through, that's going to give you a better sense as to how we spend those monies.
Right, so they're typically included for things that are that the major infrastructure, whether it's sidewalk, brick streets, road work, patching, resurfacing work. We're looking at bike plan implementation as part of that, pedestrian improvements. So a lot of these things that just kind of fall into what you would consider kind of those core infrastructure pieces that are not water and sewer items. So it excludes things like forestry items or other components along those lines, but you'll see here like it includes pavement marking program, the pavement surface rejuvenation. So there are a variety of different projects that are included in here.
Okay, but unlike the SURF, which is a fund to pay for this infrastructure investment program is just all of our infrastructure projects. Do we have a specific fund set aside from the reserves?
So we allocate dollars from different funds to it. So there isn't a specific fund like surface setup, but we allocate dollars from the general fund, the motor fuel tax, as well as the capital projects funds to pay for these different expenditures. And part of the reason really is because of that MFT dollars that we get through the state on a per capita basis. We wanted a place to collapse all of these together so we could report out to the board as well as to the community. Here are the dollars that we are committing to village infrastructure on an annual basis.
But in terms of if we are going to use reserve dollars for this, we don't, I mean, the policy for the SURF is clear. If we hit 50%, over 50% of non-recurring revenues goes into the SURF.
Mhm.
Are we intending to make a policy, like a, some kind of percentage or dollar amount for this infrastructure investment program? Or is that something that the board is going to decide on a yearly basis when we review the reserves and we see if they're above target?
So I think the idea that we're talking about here is saying that as Eric is showing you, and I'm sorry, because if I don't move in my office after a certain amount of time, the light goes out. So I just had to get up to turn it back on. We save energy. But to your question, what is, as you look at the revenues up here, one of the things that we would be doing is you would see a line item that would say that we're allocating actually reserve dollars to accomplish additional work that we would have listed down below. That's how it would show on this page. And in the general fund, you would see a reduction of the reserve because we would be saying we are going to use it for some particular purpose that's enumerated in the expenditure side.
Okay, and are you, would staff anticipate that this is something that the board would review during the budget process?
Yes.
As opposed to just having that automatic trigger like the SURF?
Oh, absolutely. So one of the things to think about, and I had mentioned it earlier, as you see here on the part of the screen that Eric is sharing with us, where it says capital projects allocation, you see bond proceeds and you see the $3,125,000. That is for Central Avenue. So a decision point that the board could potentially make is instead of allocating bond proceeds for that, you could say we are instead using a portion of our reserves to accomplish the work that's happening in Central Avenue. And you can either decide not to do the issuance at all or reduce it by a certain amount if you're going to instead backfill it with reserves.
Thank you.
Would you like me to move to the next slide, Melinda?
Yes.
All right.
So the reserve replenishment. This one is an attempt to lay out a plan. So we've been talking about if we have excess reserves, here's some ideas about how those monies could be allocated. This is the other side. And again, I'll go back to a question that Trustee Plunkett had brought up before. If our reserves fall underneath our minimum, what are the actions that we're going to take? So number one, again, the board is going to be notified that that's the case. Number two, we are going to come up with a plan to replenish those reserves within a 2-year time frame. And again, we would always be doing this with a 3-year outlook in mind. So how we would accomplish it, it would either be looking at additional revenues that we could bring in or expense reductions that we would need to undertake, and we would lay those ideas out. So in this part of the policy, we're not saying exactly what would happen because it would depend on what was causing the situation, what we could control at that particular point in time, and again, what it would mean for us over the next 3 years.
So moving to the next slide, we are looking at the 2020 year-end reserves. Now, this information was provided during the during last month's financial presentation and was based upon our preliminary year-end information. So here we looked at the general fund, the water fund, and what we did for purposes of this presentation was break out the stormwater utility comparatively to the sewer fund, because that's how we've structured the new reserve policy. So if we were to look at our preliminary year-end numbers for the general fund, we are just south of $15 million. This is approximately 42% of our 2020 expenditure budget. Our water fund is at roughly 48%. Our sewer fund is at 46%, and our stormwater utility would be at 26% comparatively to the reserve level comparatively to the budget. So what's included in that stormwater utility cost, as we mentioned before, were debt service, personnel, as well as the incentive programs. So I think if we were to go back one or two slides to we had that discussion about what we could potentially do with those excess reserves, one of the options was looking at revenue options. So on the stormwater utility side, we could potentially look here at what we could do with that stormwater utility rate moving forward. We will have a bond issuance coming up in June for phase 2 of neighborhood storage project, but we would have the option at that point in time of when we set our rates based upon that new bond issuance, the ability to potentially try to draw down the reserve levels within that stormwater utility component to more closely align with what our expected levels are. So this was really to just provide an example of where we're at based upon our 2020 preliminary information.
So, Eric, this is this is our percentage of reserve based on operating expense, which is the new way that we're going to be calculating reserves.
Yes.
If we, for the 2020 year-end reserves, had calculated it as a percentage of revenue, do you know where those percentages, would they be close?
They would be reasonably close just based upon us passing balanced budgets in each one of those spaces. The general fund might be a little bit higher because I believe revenues would have been below expenditures. But all of the other funds, they would all be within a percentage or two of where they're currently sitting at.
Yeah, you often talk about determining the level of the funds after the audit is completed, but is there really much of a change in the audited numbers compared to the unaudited numbers? Because I haven't noticed that there is.
No, but there is some difference, because what happens is at the time of the budget, we set what we expect or project it to be. And so we set that number at that point in time. And then during the course of the year, every month, we're seeing some fluctuation that's occurring. By the time you're getting your December reports, we have a fairly good idea as to how we are going to end the year. And then you are correct. By the time we have the audit, I'm trying to think of a case where we've seen a big swing. There usually is not a significant difference between what we were thinking when we looked at our December numbers compared to where we are at the time of the audit.
Given that that's the case, is there really much point in waiting until that late in the year to make a transfer if we've got an excessive budget reserve fund?
So what we've sort of talked about now and how we're contemplating things is we're trying to understand how we have ended 2020 so that we know what those reserve levels are, and it's to use it as part of our planning tool for the 2022 budget.
So you don't anticipate drawing down until the following year?
Correct.
So that may explain why it gets high. If you're not drawing it down when you actually exceed the target, but 6 months or 7 months later, that's a significant delay in our ability to use the funds. Okay, but if you haven't budgeted to spend it, I guess it doesn't do any good to move it.
So let's think about 2020 and kind of what was happening to us during the year, because that you are laying out what happens on one side of the coin. But if we flip that coin over, so if we think about where we were at this time last year, it was our concern that we were going to be below what our reserve levels were. So right. It would have been just the opposite. So we took the steps, like we said, we reduced our expenditures because we wanted to make sure that our reserve levels were still healthy enough to be able to accomplish the things that we definitely needed to get accomplished. And as we were walking into getting ready to get into the bond market. We wanted to, again, show that we had a good, strong reserve level and that we had a plan to deal with what could potentially be happening with the pandemic. As the year went on, especially as we got into the summer months and then into the fall, right, we had now revenues that performed better than what we expected. But there was at one point in time last year where we really thought things were going to be just the opposite. So the methodology that we're talking about, it is making sure that we do not spend dollars that we know we don't have.
So just to understand the timing issue, it can be, if we go over the targeted amount, we will stay over the targeted amount for a minimum of 6 to 7 months.
Yes, as we are planning it as part of that 2020 or the following year's budget process, so that we can then present that plan to the finance committee and ultimately to the village board of here are opportunities for us to draw this down as part of the following year's budget. We don't want to be too quick to pull them down in case there are any instances like this past year of a pandemic or something along those lines. We just want to make sure that it is a fully thought out process of how we're going to draw that down, and the appropriate mechanism to do that as part of that budgetary process is how we've laid it out as part of this reserve policy.
And I think the other part of it is there needs to be there needs to be time given to get those things that we're going to allocate those dollars to accomplished. And here's what I mean by that. If we're saying, do you know what, we're deciding that we're going to take $400,000 and allocate it now to the infrastructure improvement program, i.e. our road program. There needs to be time then for engineering to be able to plan for that and to decide where those dollars are going to be allocated in our larger plan that we have. If we're deciding that we're going to, if there's another large piece of capital equipment that we've decided we need to purchase, again, there needs to be time given for that purchasing process to take place. So
I totally understand that. And that's sort of the problem. You can't just dump money and not know what you're going to spend it on.
correct.
I understand that. But when it comes to some things like paying down the pension debt, the sooner you do it, the better. And so it sort of strikes me that waiting in that case doesn't make as much sense if that's what you're going to do with the money. Then what you're postulating about the capital expenditures, which I totally understand.
So you're bringing up an excellent point in the sense of, again, there's a variety of things that we have out there that we might allocate the monies to. So what also happens during this time is it gives the board a chance to think about what its priorities are. And you know how things can shift and change over time. So there would be a discussion and the analysis that would need to be done. Can we take additional monies and allocate it to the public safety pension funds? And if we do, what are we going to gain by doing that? Versus looking also at if we allocated it to the road program, what will it take? What are we going to gain? And then having that information so that you can make the decision about where your priorities are going to be. I hate to use this, but I'm going to say, where is the biggest bang for the buck? Given what your policy decisions are, that is a process and it takes time in order for that to happen. So with the pension funds in particular, that is one that that we are working with our actuary as they are wrapping up our reports this year to look at modeling if we allocated additional funds beyond what we've already thought of to get us to the 15-year rolling amortization. Can we get there quicker? If we do, what does that mean for then, again, looking at the out years, what does that mean for us in terms of our employer contributions in the future and what that could mean for our tax levy? Those are things that we're looking at so that we would have some of that information available as we look at how we believe we're ending 2020 and that we believe we're going to be above our target levels. If this is what we're saying our target levels are, we're trying to gather those facts together so that as we go into the 2022 budget process, you will have the information you need to make some of those decisions.
Good. That would be great.
So can I just understand then? So looking at this general fund, so in our document, we say percent of operating expense, or in the draft document. But are we really doing it off of operating expense or the budgeted operating expense? That versus actual? Because obviously
It's
we're not
being
using
based
actual
upon-
last year because you guys cut out $2 million of expense, but that was sort of one-time saving. So I get that.
We're basing it off of the budgeted expenditures, not the actual expenditures. Just to your point exactly, is if we make modifications to that expenditure budget in a year, we don't want to artificially decrease that level, which would change the calculation here and drive up that reserve level comparatively.
So, and I'm just trying to follow Trustee Kennedy's logic, because I think that's the issue of the timing. If in the slide we have up here, if going back to our minimum and target of 30%, and obviously we're at 42, we're over reserved technically by $4.3 million
Correct.
Yes.
from our target. But is that money already allocated, or is that sort of let's talk about it over the next 12 months and see how that year goes?
Well, and I think that's part of the discussion of when we get to the point here where we talk about before we're being at 42%. We would then notify the board. Per the policy, our intent would be to notify the board of where we are at. And then what we would want to do is provide that 3-year outlook to see if there were already other items that were allocated. So if we are already allocated $500,000 towards pensions as part of the 2021 budget, or to try to draw some of those reserves down, we would give the full board and the finance committee an outlook of 3 years and determining the best way that we could spend those funds over the next 3 years. And review those options for future years. It's really what we're trying to work on here is the policy to set the stage for how we develop a plan to draw down those reserves in future years.
Can I dovetail off of something that Eric was just talking about right now? So Trustee Sullivan, to your point, if we say that right now we think if this policy was in place that we're over reserved by, let's just say $4 million, that's looking at the end of 2020. But we know that as we put together our projections for 2021, 22, and 23, we have said that we want to get to that 15-year rolling amortization period, and that was going to require a certain amount of monies allocated in order for that to happen. It was roughly $500,000 over the next several years. In theory, that would be drawing down some of that reserve monies that we are talking about. So if we are to stay on that path to do it, and if we have balanced budgets in the next several years, if that's what our projections are showing, then we would be using that at least $1 million, let's just say $1.5 million to accomplish the 15-year rolling amortization. It would already be pulling down that $4 million when you look at it over the next 3 years.
$1.5 million over 3 years, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Not
So I get that. I get that. I think the issue is when I look at the budget numbers, when we approved the budget, we were approving it based on where our 2020 estimate was of a reserve, which was 12.9 or 13 million. And obviously we came in, going back to the slide, we're up $1.5 million higher, but we still have a budget that says at the end of this next calendar year, we're gonna have a reserve at 10.8 million. Are we gonna spend that excess $1.5 million this year, or are we gonna have? That's what that sort of seems to be the pattern that we're in right now, is that we never get back down to the budget. And some of the comments are, we go in with excess, but do we spend it? So to my question, so if is our new reserve budget for 2021, whatever, 11.3, 12.3.
Yes, it would be that $1.5 million higher. And I think that is part of what we would want to bring back to the board as part of that outlook for over the next 3 years, is providing those updated figures for the next year's budget, as well as providing information out into 23, 24, and into future years to see, to come up with that plan to draw those additional dollars down that are on top of what was previously reported to the board.
Versus saying, okay, to the board, we have an extra, we came in, 2020 wasn't as bad. We're now have $1.5 million higher than what we expected. So should we make decisions and allocate that $1.5 million to pensions, roads, whatever this year, so the residents get some of the benefits and still work towards our budget of what we presented to them to the 10.8?
I think that goes back to Melinda's point earlier, especially on the road side, is making sure that we have that capacity to take on those additional work pieces. But I think that's kind of to me, that was always the next step, the next iteration of this conversation about the reserve policy. Was first, let's lay out where we're at from a policy perspective, and then we can figure out the mechanics of what we want to do specifically, that we can, through the finance committee, come up with a game plan of, do we want to try to allocate dollars immediately, or do we want to allocate those dollars as part of the 2022 budget or future year budgets? That was kind of, to me, I always saw that as phase 2 of this conversation, whereas this was focusing more on what do we want to set our parameters at, how do we want to calculate our reserves, and how do we want to set the plans for either drawing down reserve levels or building reserve levels back up.
I have a question to throw in here too. So I understand the overall plan is that we look at this every year in the budget process, and we have a 3-year outlook. There's a couple things that you mentioned that I don't know when the decision dates are on. That was the Central Street bond issuance and some of the stormwater bond issuances. Do you foresee the board, are we making decisions sooner on whether or not we're going to use some of those reserves, either as part of that Central Street or on the stormwater side as that? Because I feel like those questions are going to come up before this, budgetary annual reserve discussion.
So the central project that would, so I on that one in particular, so that would be part of potentially the issuance that we do in June. So we would still have some time to talk about whether or not we want to go forward and issue the debt for that, or whether we want to use some reserves to pay for it. So that would be one that would be happening in that sort of a time frame. The stormwater one, though, I think what we were talking about with that was if we are bringing down our required reserve level on just the stormwater component of what is in the sewer fee down to the 5%, then we would have, that's going to automatically create some additional reserves that are sitting in that fund, in theory, over time. And how this would manifest itself is that we wouldn't need the rate increases that we had thought we had needed before in the out years. So that's where I was saying it would allow us to project lower rate increases in the future to be able to meet our debt service requirements.
But do you think, so as early as June, do you think there'll be a decision point for the board on the Central Street bond issuance? And if so, are we weighing different options then? Because if we, we could spend some of the reserves on that. Maybe it depends on what the rates are,
Right.
How good a rate we're going to get, or we need to think about what other things that we might be looking at, come October in the budget process. Does that make sense? And I'm, just kind of, anyway, I think I said the question.
No, I think It does make sense, and it makes, okay. So, so we will be re-engaging again with our financial advisor shortly for them to start again getting us ready to go into the bond market again. And as part of that process, they will be advising us in terms of where the market is right now and what we might expect our debt service numbers to look like. So to your point, Trustee Plunkett, if we see that rates are going to be higher than maybe what we would like to see, that would be a reason for us to come back and say we might need to make a decision on this sooner rather than later, that it's not just a 2022 budget item that we're talking about, but that it's going to impact an action that we're going to take in 2021, and that we would see it's more advisable for us to use our reserves to pay for that remaining portion of the Central Avenue project than it would be to go to the market and issue the bonds on it. So that will be part of the analysis that we'll be having our financial advisor work on now. So to your point, to what I had said earlier, I was indicating that what we're coming, how this is all coalescing, it was to impact decisions that we're making for the 2022 budget. I guess that's not entirely true, because here's a decision that would impact something that we were going to do in 2021. So it's not entirely all about the 2022 budget. This could impact something that happens in 2021.
Okay.
And I'm just telling you right now, we are sensitive to that, and these are some of the things that we're working on already.
Thank you.
So looking at the last slide here that we have on the presentation is what we were looking for to come out of this discussion was a consensus on a reserve policy recommendation, and then formalizing a policy recommendation to the village board. The next meeting is April 13th. I wanted to gauge if we were in a position to move forward with our current draft policy, or if there were other modifications that we wanted to make to that. I know the one that we have noted is on the use of the reserves from Trustee Kennedy regarding potential modifications to the language around expenditures. But I just wanted to kind of get feedback from from everybody on if this is something that we would feel comfortable moving forward with, or if there are other areas that we would want to see potential changes in.
I want to ask about the policy number, because for the first time ever, we have now talking about a minimum reserve level of 25% versus I've always heard 30%, 30%, 30%. So what is the rationale for that? And, number one, how do rating agencies see that? And then while we're talking about rating agencies, just want to confirm that, they would, be equally as favorable as a reserve level based on operating expenses as they were on our revenues before.
So, Eric, I know you're pulling something up. I'll start and then please chime in. So there's a couple things that I wanted to say in regards to that. First off, if you might recall in the packet, and it's right towards the end of the packet, you're going to see a survey that was done, and it lays out a bunch of other municipalities and sort of the parameters that they have in place for their fund balance policies. So it's right at the back of the packet if you have it in front of you. And this information that you see here, although it's displayed a little differently and there's a little bit more, it was also provided in the packet that we had last time to give you some sense as to where other folks were. So as I say all of this to you, there's going to be a couple takeaways from it. Number one, there is no consistency. Number two, if you start to look at things, you do see that this 25%, even though some go higher, I don't think there's any that are lower that I see right away. 25 seems to be the low end of the number, and some of them go up higher from there when you're looking at the general fund. The enterprise funds are handled a little differently than ours, but so my first point that I was saying to you, there's no consistency. What we are proposing to you, though, is definitely not an outlier, though, from what you see here. So that is our comparison to surrounding communities. When we talk about Moody's, Moody's has always done their comparison based on the expenditures, not on the revenue side. So that answers another one of your questions. And then when it came to GFOA and sort of the recommendations, I'll let Eric talk about it a little bit more because I thought he did a great job sort of laying it out. But it also, I'm going to tell you, as my lights go out again, that it does not give you a clear answer on that either. But I'm going to turn my lights back on. I'll let Eric answer.
Right. So to speak to the expenditure side, when we looked to GFOA for guidance on that space, it was really, they felt it was at the discretion of the municipality based upon what each municipality felt was the more consistent side of the equation, whether it was going to be revenues or expenditures, that there wasn't necessarily one was not better than the other. We chose expenditures for the items that we had enumerated earlier, just because they're more stable and predictable, that we want to be able to make sure that we can fund our public services. And so for those two reasons, we felt that the expenditure side was the more appropriate one to go with for this calculation. I think the other part, just to touch on, is at this point in time, we are not reducing our reserve minimum. In fact, we are increasing our reserve minimum. Right now, our reserve is stated as the minimum is 200% of the projected 2-month shortfall between estimated revenues and expenditures in January and February. That works out to roughly 12 to 13%. That is what our minimum currently is. We are increasing that minimum up to 25%, but we are holding our target steady at 30% from our current policy to the new policy. So we're bringing the bottom end up, but we're keeping that top end consistent.
I was frankly, the last time before we met last time, the packet included the same materials about other towns. I was shocked at the variation. So is there no sort of guidance like the commercial side of the world has as to what's sort of reasonable policy and what is not?
No, there does not appear to be, and I think each municipality has had its own particular instances where it might keep reserves at different levels. We saw in some communities where they wanted to have certain dollar thresholds associated with insurance because they may have had an issue with insurance at some point in their past. So each community's own experiences really have dictated how they've developed their policies.
One of the other things to think about is it probably changes over time as well. So there's a couple things to that. So if we think about, if we go back several years and we knew that we did not have a large reserve balance, so it's the 2 million that we just had referenced a little while ago. If we had a 25% reserve policy at that time, in order to get to that, what it would have taken I'm going to guess it would have been significant property tax increases to allow that to happen, because we didn't have really the other revenue sources for that to happen. But our major revenue source is property tax, and it was even a larger share of our budget at that time, and it's a very stable revenue source, which is why, although the rating agencies had always highlighted that as being a credit negative for us, they weren't as concerned because, again, our largest revenue source was very stable. If we were a community that was reliant on sales tax, if that was a larger portion of our budget, there would have been more concern about the way we structured our reserve policy, because, again, it's very economically sensitive. So that's one of the factors. And I think that's what Eric was alluding to right now. I think what you see in the policies as they're put together, it depends on the flavor for which their revenue sources make up their operating budget, determines their comfort level. The other piece of it is, it's really going to be, what is your objective for what your reserve policy is going to do? Now, for the village, up until the discussion that we're having now, before it truly was driven by, do we have enough cash on hand to avoid having to go out and issue a tax anticipation warrant? That truly was the genesis behind what Eric just read to you in terms of the 200% of the January and the February number. That was the genesis behind it. We're not in that position anymore, and we've laid out even more things that our reserve policy can do for us. It's not just cash flow, but we really are developing a rainy day policy here that is more in line now with what the rating agencies are saying. So that's my last point that I want to make to you. Although all the communities have different ways of looking at things, you do have entities out there, the rating agencies, that actually do have a fairly structured matrix in the way that they look at you. So they always wanted the village to have a higher reserve, but for the reasons that I've already articulated, they said it was a credit negative, but we had enough other things in our favor, which is why we were still able to say stay AAA. Does that answer some of the questions?
Yeah. So when you look at these, Naperville and Deerfield and so forth, they're not necessarily comparable. So,
Right.
so
Yes.
looking at them is not necessarily informative, I guess I would say, to how we deal with the situation, because their revenue sources and the
They're
may be
making,
very, very, very different. Skokie definitely is. I don't know about the others, but and I noticed you did include Skokie in there. So it may it's
And I think that was part of the reason in giving this is to give that understanding that it wasn't to show we should be modeling off of these other communities. It's that there isn't a good guidance. There isn't a rhyme or reason. There's a rhyme or reason on a local level, but there isn't one that a one size fits all solution for each community. And I think that's what we were trying to get through as part of the presentation of what other communities were at. And I'll give you an example from the Naperville side. When you looked at the 30 days of operating expenditures for water and electric, between those two, that was roughly $25 million. And we had a policy that was, we were very loose in our ability to transfer between funds. So we took it as a much broader overall approach for the organization, similar to what Deerfield is doing in theirs, is that they wanted to have a combined reserve across everybody because they have the ability to do interfund transfers more frequently, or they're more open to that concept.
bless you. Bless you.
It's spring.
I know. I know.
fortunately and unfortunately.
know.
So are we to the point now where you want an answer to your question about whether we're ready to go to the board?
If we have further discussion, we can certainly go through all of that. But I mean, if we want to move on to sort of some decision point on what we want to put forth to the village board, I think that would be helpful. Or if there's other things that you want us to research before we go to the village board, the whole village board, I think we can certainly want to have all of that input so that we can put the best recommendation forth.
I don't really see a need for more research. Trustee Sullivan, do you?
No, I think this is good information. I think unfortunately we're trying to solve something that's not solvable. As we, in the packet, how many times have we met on this as a board and sort of flip flop? So I think the more communication and where we are is probably helpful. I mean, and we've talked about this. So I think I'm fine taking the board. I think the key for us is the clarity, because when I look back at it, and we did in October of, I think it was October of 19. Let's make sure I have my numbers right. Yeah, it was October. we did a big presentation, but we said, the reserve amount, per Moody's guidelines at that time was 30% of operating revenues. Then we flipped to 30% of operating expenses. I actually agree with the expenses versus revenues. And then, in that last debate we had when President Belinsky said that's a floor, I think just adding clarity to the board that we talk about this and say, what is a floor? What's a ceiling? How do we address, any excess? And we're in a good position. And I think that actually helped us through the last year. So the more communication, the better. So no, I agree with Trustee Kennedy. You've done a great research. There's a good presentation, and let's let the board sort of, the more we're feeding the board with information, they can make the decisions and guide you. So,
Trustee Plunkett, how do you feel about this?
No, I agree. And I think, at the next board meeting, I think it's just helpful to, to lay it out, to say, this is what we're going to do every year. We might come before you in June on the Central Street. There might be a couple things, we might come early that we need to decide, which I think is the case, I think from my understanding, but no, I mean, we're in a great position. So, these aren't bad problems to have. It's fantastic that, we are having this discussion instead of, having the discussion of, how to build back up the reserves. Yeah, I'm excited to get started on this and lay it out. This minor point, and this is just, on the different towns and comparing it. It would be nice to know if these towns are all AAA rated or, where they are in that. Just so, we're comparing ourselves with, other towns and maybe the size of the town, is going to make a bigger difference on that. But I was just kind of curious on that one.
And Trustee Plunkett, to that point, what we did include, these were all AAA communities. And that is part of the reason why one of the aforementioned communities of Skokie was excluded from this analysis. So we were really looking at other communities that were in the same financial status from a AAA perspective as Wilmette.
Okay, with that, I think that we do want to go to the board with this. I'd still like to see some change in that very, very broad language about what you can spend the reserve on.
Yep.
So
I never circle back on that, but I agree with you, Trustee
send that to
Kennedy.
the group just to have a final sign off on that piece.
Okay. And,
No,
and anything else that people want to discuss at this point, let's do it.
No, I think it's good work. I meant to just circle back. I agree with Trustee Kennedy. That language is very, very broad. So
Okay.
don't box yourself into something that, people get questioned. I mean, so
Okay.
that's a good point. But this is really nice work.
Yes.
And I know it's not easy. So good job and very helpful.
So do we need to have to vote on it to move it forward to the board?
I think we do.
Okay.
Yeah.
So do you want to call the roll on the vote? Oh, first of all, motion. Do I have a motion to approve taking this to the board?
So moved.
Second?
Second.
So can you take a roll, please?
Yes. Trustee Plunkett,
Aye.
Trustee Sullivan,
Aye.
Chair Kennedy.
Aye. The motion passes. Is that all you need from us in terms of procedural stuff?
Yes, and so what we will do is we will pull together the recommendation for the April 13th meeting, and then from there we will look to build out some of the other items that the trustee has mentioned here, including Trustees Plunkett's point about what are different decision points we may have throughout the year.
Do we have to ask for public comment on this one?
I would like to, just because we've been through a lot of stuff tonight. So if there's any public comment after our discussion, welcome it.
Unfortunately, there's no public comment on YouTube Live.
Okay.
Nor through the public comment email address.
Okay. Then I think the next item of business is new business. There is no new business. And the next is old business, and there is no old business. So Is there a motion to adjourn?
So moved.
Second.
Okay.
Thanks, everyone.
Oh, we have to take a vote, don't we?
Oh,
Sorry,
we
Oh,
do.
we had two. Yeah, to adjourn?
I think so.
Yeah.
Okay. So did somebody motion and second the motion?
Yes, we
Oh,
did.
Melinda, you weren't even listening. You were already leaving the meeting.
Okay, because the lights are gonna turn
The
off
lights
again,
were
all
gonna-
right? That's what's gonna
I
happen.
may say no. I may say no to this just so we can continue. Just to have a little fun.
Trustee Plunkett,
I.
Trustee Sullivan,
You can go home.
Chair Kennedy.
Aye. Thank you very much,
Fantastic.
everyone.